Stories of strange creatures roaming the mountains and forests are as old as time itself. Generations have handed down accounts of giants living in the wild. Some say they're wild humans, others describe them as ape-like animals. Still, others claim they're spiritual beings that shapeshift and vanish at will. A friend of mine shared a chilling tale from his childhood in the 1940s. Living in a remote area far from neighbors and towns, his family relied on gardening, hunting, and fishing to survive. He ventured into the woods like he had countless times before. But this time it felt different, like he was the one being hunted. The woods were home to predators like bears and wild cats, enough to keep anyone on edge. But this felt different. Something was making even the wildlife uneasy. The silence was deafening. Knowing he'd have to go without meat, the boy turned back. As he reached the clearing near his home, he heard branches snapping behind him. He turned to see a towering creature, at least 10 feet tall, covered in long, gray, almost white hair. Its glowing eyes locked onto him. He stood motionless for a few moments before turning to run home, leaving the creature standing just beyond the tree line. I believe it was the devil, he told me. And until the day he died, my friend maintained that his story was true. Stories like his suggest there's something in the hills of the Appalachians and scattered across North America and beyond. As fascinating as these tales are, one account stands out above the rest. It comes from none other than the legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone. Boone is a hero in American history and Appalachian culture, but this story isn't as widely known today. The account is found among a massive collection of manuscripts by Lyman C. Draper. Draper spent his life collecting articles, letters, and stories about Boone, hoping to write the ultimate biography. Draper wrote 800 pages but passed away before completing it. However, his collection remains a treasure trove for those studying Boone and early America. In the late 1870s, Draper corresponded with Buckner Payne, who, as a boy, met an elderly Daniel Boone. Payne recalled Boone's incredible yet supposedly true tale. Colonel Daniel Boone traveled from Missouri to his son-in-law's in Greensburg by land and reached Judge Montgomery's sometime in July. Payne's letter begins. Such was the quiet manner of his arriving that scarcely any knew who it was until after he reached the residence of his son-in-law's near Greensburg, Kentucky. Judge Montgomery put his family and affects in a flatboat, and as before said, reached Maysville the last of October, where he remained about 8 days. It was about the 2nd of November that he dined with Mr. Moss, and on the evening of that day, a party was given him at the house of Henry Macker to afford the ladies an opportunity of seeing and shaking hands with the distinguished man. On the morning of that day, he came into our store, which was a large one, where he was soon surrounded by many citizens and all of his old pioneer associates. At about 11 o'clock, Captain James Ward said to him, "Colonel Boone, I would like for you to recite your encounter that you had with a giant which you killed. I would like to have my own memory refreshed, and there are many here who have never heard your account of it from your own lips." My father, Reverend William Payne, remarked at this moment that he, the giant, was over 10 feet high. There was present in the company a gentleman by the name of Campbell, who inadvertently and without thought said, "Impossible that any man could be so high." Captain James Ward immediately responded, "Mr. Campbell, you must leave here now, for while you stay, Colonel Boone will not open his mouth again." And they went on to explain Colonel Boone's peculiarity in not speaking in the presence of anyone that had thrown a shade of doubt over what he had said or might say, and which my father confirmed. Colonel Boone having said in response to my father that the giant was over 10 feet high, the unfortunate remark of Mr. Campbell painfully suspended all further talk while Campbell remained so far as Colonel Boone was concerned. This painful suspense was relieved about 12 o'clock by the coming in of Mr. Moss and taking the colonel and his old friends to his house for refreshments and dinner, and I did not hear the giant story then. I was delighted at about 4 o'clock by the return of the old gentleman and some of his friends to the store, where they remained until it was time to go to Mr. Matcher's to the party. The letter continues. On our way to Mr. Matcher's residence, I walked beside Colonel Boone and said to him that when he wished to leave the party, for him to give me a square of the arm, and I would get his hat, and we would quietly leave by the back way and come back to the store. He said, "Thank you, honey, I shall depend on you, for I dislike to be in a crowd where I have to receive so much attention." I was surprised at his giving me the signal about 9 o'clock, though delighted with the hope of hearing the giant story. On reaching the counting room where we had plenty of fine apples, I said to him that I longed to hear the story about the giant. He replied, "You shall have it, honey, but I would not have opened my lips to this time if that man had remained. Colonel Boone said it was in the spring of the year, that he was then living at Boonesboro, that the corn was about half leg high, that on getting up one Sunday morning he found his 2 horses had been stolen by Indians. He saw by the signs that there were 2 Indians. He and his son immediately got ready and went in pursuit. They pursued the track to the headwaters of Hinkston Creek to Calk Spring, which had the date of February 1778, which had been cut on a tree by William Calk, who entered the land and was living on it when I knew him. Boone was present when the tree was marked. They pursued the track down the creek and crossed the little mound where Mount Sterling is now located. They pursued the track down the creek to where it empties into Licking River, which they crossed to the right bank in pursuit. The track went down Licking River to the Ohio, to where Cincinnati now stands. They had come so near upon the Indians that their fire was still burning, where the Indians had stayed before they crossed the Ohio River. He and his son immediately made a raft and crossed over. But on ascending the opposite bank, they found signs of about 500 Indians. They knew that further pursuit was useless and turned back and landed below the mouth of Licking River. This was about 3 o'clock in the evening, intending to go about 10 miles down to a spring that he knew of, which came out at the foot of a hill where there was fine open woods and grass, usually abounded in deer, and they stood in need of provisions, as they could shoot none while in pursuit of the Indians, for fear of putting them on the alert by the report of their guns. They found the spring and encamped. There was some rain that night, and the next morning was misty and foggy. The hill ran in the direction of their way home. Boone took one side of the hill and his son the other, and as they walked about the same speed they could be in hearing of each other's guns. At about 10 o'clock, the fog having cleared off, he heard his son's gunfire and immediately heard it fire again. From the last report, he knew that the bullet had been put down by his son without a patch. He immediately hastened to the crest of the hill, as he feared that his son had either shot a bear or panther and wounded it, and it had made fight. But on reaching the top of the hill, he could not see his son anywhere. But on looking for a moment, he saw at 250 yards from him the largest man that he had ever seen. He was walking very fast with his face set at a particular direction. On casting his eyes in the same direction, he saw his son behind a tree loading his gun, and the giant about 75 yards from him. He immediately leveled his gun, but there were so many trees and the giant walked so fast that he was afraid to shoot for fear he might miss. The giant got up to his son and caught him by his buckskin dress with one hand, while with the other he jerked his gun from him, threw it, and brake it off at the breech. Then catching his son by the nape of the neck and the seat of his breeches, and raised him up over his head just as easy, honey, as I would raise up a child, and slammed him on the ground. He raised him the second time and slammed him the same way. At this point in the letter, Payne begins to speak from Boone's point of view. I was afraid to shoot for fear of wounding or killing my son, but know I had to shoot or a third slam would be sure to kill my son if it had not already done it. While the giant was stooping to raise him the third time, I fired and the giant fell over on my son. I immediately ran up and jerked him off to find my son senseless and not breathing. I immediately made every effort for his restoration to life. It seemed to me more than an hour before he breathed. He finally came to, and after using water freely from my canteen, I so far recovered him as to set him up against the tree, and was glad to find no bones broken. In about an hour more he stood up and talked. I asked him where he had aimed to strike the giant. He said he had aimed to hit him in the heart, both shots. The giant was naked. I turned him over on his back and found both of the bullet holes near the left nipple and about 2 inches apart, but neither of them had entered the body but had passed round and came out at the back. I then passed my finger into each of the holes and found the giant had no ribs, but solid bone about 3/4 of an inch thick, which I found out by cutting through the bone with my tomahawk. My own shot struck him in the left eye, which was fortunate. The giant was not an Indian, for he was a pale yellow with long yellowish hair, and not black as is common among Indians. His body was likewise covered with short hair, not very thick. His teeth were all naturally grown together in his head, with rather small eyes and nose, with very large feet and hands. We then stretched him out, laid a supplejack 9 feet, and we measured his length, and in measuring it with my hands, I found that he was at least 10.5 feet high. My son then got another supplejack, and we then made another measurement. One of these was carried by my son and me by myself to Boonesboro, where we measured them by the squares, when we found the height to be 10 feet 8 inches. This is the story of the giant as given me by Colonel Boone. I asked if he had ever heard of any such among the Indians and what they knew about them, if anything. He said they had a tradition of giant men and giant beasts, but that the Great Spirit had killed them all somewhere on the Osage River, Missouri, but that he had never credited it. This letter, written in January of 1876, was one of several letters found among the Draper manuscripts. The others were much shorter and included the names of many of the men who attended the gatherings for Colonel Boone while he visited Maysville. The other letters also mentioned that a man identified as Judge Hall had written a biography of Boone with the facts told to him straight from Boone himself. Payne asked Hall if Boone had told him the tale of killing a giant. Hall opened the book and revealed that he had included the story in the biography. The details matched all that Boone had told Payne. I was unable to locate this biography, but it would be nice to have such a piece of history to look over. I'd like to mention that I stumbled across this story from another YouTube video. I was happy to find links to the source of the letters in the description there. That video is linked in the description. The Draper manuscripts are available for public viewing. Some were collected into books, others are only available on microfilm and can be accessed only at the library. If you're interested, the Buckner Payne letters can be found in Series C, Volume 16 of the Draper manuscripts. I hope you've enjoyed this little piece of strange American history. If you have any story suggestions or opinions you'd like to share, leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.